Good morning. Welcome to our weekly conversation. I'm Pastor Jane Gingrich, and I serve Hills of Peace Lutheran Church here in Kamloops, BC.
I'm Pastor John Boyd, and I serve St. George's Anglican Church here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
Welcome to our weekly conversation. As a clergy couple, we regularly have conversations about everything under the sun, and then we sometimes film one or two of them to share with you as part of a dialogue. On Thursday mornings, we continue that dialogue, and last week, as we were talking, the topic of predestination versus foreknowledge came up. And so today, we've decided to engage that dialogue between ourselves as two perspectives within a variety of perspectives within our traditions. And so, would you like to start us off by telling us about predestination?
At this point, I think I would just give my understanding of predestination from a variety of sources and from what I've been able to understand. I'm glad that we put disclaimers on all of this. My reading of predestination is another way of saying the divine economy, or the way in which God has chosen to create us and to save us as a completion of creation. And so predestination refers to the way in which God has chosen to structure and arrange the world, the passage of time, and our involvement in it, so that by the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, we are given faith, and we come to be aware of God as God is, and also then that our lives become lived in accordance with that faith and understanding. And on a more detailed level, it would also refer to the way in which individually, through specific moments, even moments of losing faith and then returning to faith, that God has arranged how that's going to unfold for us in our personal life story. That's my initial understanding of it. Oh, sorry.
Would that fit with a person's understanding of predestination, where something happens in their life and they say, well, that was predestined, God caused that?
That's the way that people have come to understand it. I would say sometimes it's possible for us to make those assertions, usually only looking backwards on our life from the perspective of faith and the perspective of Jesus, where we see parts of our lives that conform to who we understand Jesus to be, in our worship, in our baptism, in the celebration of the Lord's Supper, in the preaching of the gospel about who Jesus is and what Jesus does, that when we see moments of our life history resonate with that, then we're seeing the activity of God creating our life story, or predetermining how it is our life unfolds. I know that people tend to look at things in the present as they happen and make that call. I think that's risky. I think it's hard to say in the moment whether God's up to something or whether you just messed up. God has predetermined how that messing up is going to be redeemed. But I think we also have to be careful, because occasionally there are moments in which we hear God actively in other people, like the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and the determination that Pharaoh's going to send out troops after the Israelites and pursue them. The question then becomes how to interpret that from the perspective of salvation in Jesus Christ. So I think it's fair to say I don't really know. I tend to lean towards God working that in that particular way, but more about how and why later as the conversation unfolds. What about foreknowledge?
Well, as I understand it, and the way I imagine it, is as beloved of God, created by God, we are so thoroughly, completely, and deeply known by God. That God knows all of the choices and possibilities and experiences that could happen ahead of us. And God knows all of the choices that we will make as those opportunities, choices, experiences, and life unfold before us. And so God foreknows, or God has foreknowledge of all that will occur and is occurring in the world, because God so deeply knows God's own creation and all of the beings within it. That doesn't mean that God is simply passively watching as everything happens and, enjoying or being displeased about it all. There is also the inbreaking, or the breaking through of the Holy Spirit, the power of God, the presence of Christ throughout our lives, and that looks different at different times and might come unexpectedly, or might come when prayed for, or again, hard to know unless we're reflecting or looking back with the eyes of faith. And yet God is the one who always knows when this will happen and what that will look like, because God foreknows all that will be and all that will happen. I would not say that means that God intends for all the things that happen in the world to happen. From a perspective of foreknowledge, while God knows all that will happen, God also knows that there is suffering and brokenness, and that this world is a place that is not always easy or kind. But God never departs from us or abandons us in this world. And so foreknowledge, from my perspective, is mostly an understanding that while we live and breathe and move in the world, it's not as puppets, or it's not by some means that God has already declared will be, but that God knows exactly what will be and breaks in and participates in this life with us throughout our lives and throughout the lives of those around us as well. There are many aspects of this conversation that could lead to a conversation about will or choice, and I don't want to go there in this conversation because that's a whole other conversation, but they are not mutually exclusive, certainly. And so thinking about how this impacts our faith, I know that there are many who have experiences or perhaps reflections on how God is present with us. And I would say that an understanding of foreknowledge or belief in predestination has a very large impact on that. Are there any conversations that you've had or experiences that would be appropriate to share that you can say a person was impacted by their understanding of either predestination or foreknowledge or God's presence with them?
I think there are a couple of poignant examples that I've encountered of, I think, a harmful or a negative spin on predestination that I find problematic. That, of course, for reasons of our humanity, challenge the whole idea of predestination. It's almost as though it is an offense to our sensibilities that God would engineer or architect all of these happenings in the way in which history and time unfold. And I'm referring specifically to the death of a child. And in some ways, it's often been explained, or I've heard presiding over the funerals of children, things like this, that God had a plan for this child, or God wanted an angel and this child died to go to prepare a place for its parents in heaven and things like that. And I think there are ways in which we experience human suffering that call into question the validity of a God who would allow this kind of suffering and death to happen. So we get immediately into that modern field of theology called theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? Which, as I said, we find that repugnant, the idea of a loving God who would allow this kind of stuff to happen. And I think that's where I have to be very careful pastorally walking through that with them. Predestination is not a conversation that I feel in those times is a good thing to delve into, because I don't know how that would actually comfort people's consciences. And that's a big thing for me as a Lutheran. So that is where, in some ways, myself on my own, though I don't like it, tend to read those passages, and especially Job and Jonah, and realize that we are creations as generous gifts of God. God doesn't need us in that sense. The question becomes then, why would God choose to create us, and why does God then create some of us that die at an early age, and some of us are allowed to live on in other ways, and these kinds of things? And I think the more that we think about that in those terms, and the more we gain a sense of ourselves, the more the question gets put back to God, which is, well, you owe me a certain amount of respect and love and care. And I think we forget the fundamental position that God is the creator and we are the creature. And if we are not owed anything by God, then God can do with us as God pleases. And I think that is very hard for humans to swallow, especially when we encounter the loving Christ. But it is interesting that this is kind of God's response to Job and to Jonah as well, that your ideas of human justice and what you deserve and everything else like that fall flat in the face of the fact that in my sheer power, I created you and gave you life. You are mine. And I don't know what the end of that dialogue is, or the purpose of God addressing us in that way, but I think that God addresses us in that way when we tend to forget who and what we are, when we forget that fundamental relationship that God calls us into having.
And yet,
yeah.
I would say in hearing that it's not so much a question of deserving, or you used another term as well, but deserving stuck out to me, as it is that as created beings, all that God gives us is gift. And so the things could be entirely awful all the time, only forever.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not. There is love. There is peace. There is community. There is new life. There is hope. There is joy. And there doesn't have to be those things. And so, I suppose what you're saying about having that sense of deserving, or feeling like we have earned whatever it might be, or sense of justice, that's what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Those are human-made, human-invented ways of thinking, and in a society where we do have rights and privileges and legislated means of behavior towards one another, submission, obeying, listening to a God who doesn't follow any of those rules, societal norms, is a huge challenge. And yet, God knows us. And because God knows us. God knows that sometimes we do need to hear the hard things. And so God doesn't intervene at all times. And as we read, suffering produces endurance, etc., etc. And so there is a sense of faith being most central to all of what we're talking about, and that for God, faith is most important. And any of what we might call the positive, happy, joyful experiences of life are extra. And so getting back to predestination and foreknowledge, it is very much a challenge then to imagine that God doesn't intervene whenever there's suffering, or that God allows for as much pain in the world to exist as it does, all while we do know that much of that is self-inflicted and human-created.
Tell me more, and please feel free to use pastoral examples, because I tend to think visually, and that's helpful for me. The way in which God breaks in terms of God's foreknowledge. Say more about that. So God understands things as they are, and then there are these moments that God breaks in. Tell us more about the moments.
Well, personal experience is the easiest to share. Thinking of when I have been abroad, I've shared this story before of living with a family where everything was very different. The religion was different, the language was different, the family traditions was different, the sleeping arrangements and means of mobility and everything was different. Living abroad in West Africa for several months. And it was my first time in such a different community from what I had lived in, and away from any family or friends that I had known before. And within a couple of weeks, I was quite overwhelmed by the experience. And yet, one evening, my mama came out. I was on the front kind of a stoop of the house, and sitting there quite upset, but just feeling how stuck I was in the situation and feeling very uncomfortable about that. And her coming out and recognizing that what I needed was a sense of community and family. And so she came out and asked, "What's going on with you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm fine." And she said, "Oh, no, you're not. I know when you're fine. You're not fine." And so I actually told her about how, the food wasn't the same, and I know she was doing her best. And the language wasn't the same, but I was grateful that we had a language that was in common. And my work was overwhelming, but I was glad to be in an environment where I could be learning as much as I was, working in a health center among women and very small children. And she listened to all of that and then said, "And you're alone, aren't you?" And that's what got me. That's what I felt, was that I was alone. And she said, "Well, girl, you're here. You're my daughter, and I'm your mother." And she hugged me. And hugging was not culturally normal. So that was a really big deal for me. And looking back, I've always seen that as a moment in my life where God broke through. And my mama in Benin was God to me in that moment, was Christ to me. And so that's where I would say, God knew what I needed and worked through my mama, broke through my mama to give me what I needed in that time. And all of us have stories where we've been low, or where something has really hurt, or where we didn't know how we were going to get out of a situation and something happened, or someone happened. And there is God. Thank you for listening. Join us tomorrow on Thursday morning from 10 a.m. until 11 a.m. on Zoom to continue the conversation and let us know what you think. Predestination, foreknowledge, what fits with your understanding of how God is present with us and engages us in our lives. See you tomorrow.